The cabin wasn't much to look at, but it was ours for the weekend. A few of us from work had rented it to escape the grind for a bit. 4 rooms, a wraparound porch, and a view of the woods that stretched as far as you could see. It had that weathered look, like it had been there for decades, battered by wind and rain. The front steps creaked underfoot as we carried our things inside. The wood stove in the corner was the main source of heat, and the water pressure was barely a trickle, but it was charming in its way. The first night was uneventful. We drank too much, cooked on the old iron stove, and stayed up playing cards until the early hours. By the time I crawled into the lumpy bed in my room, the others were already snoring in theirs. The quiet was absolute, save for the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees outside. It was the kind of silence that presses on your ears, amplifying every creak of the old cabin as it settled. The second day we decided to explore. There was no Wi-Fi, no phone signal, and no nearby neighbors to speak of, just miles of trees in every direction. We packed sandwiches and water bottles and followed a dirt path that wound into the forest behind the cabin. It was peaceful, the kind of walk that clears your head. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, and the sunlight filtered through the canopy above. We joked around, took turns pointing out squirrels and birds, and kept an eye out for the trail markers nailed to the trees. It wasn't long before we came across the campsite. A clearing opened up suddenly, and there it was, a cluster of tents, 2 coolers lying open, and a small circle of stones where a fire had been. It looked like people had left in a hurry. One of the tents was half collapsed, and the other was zipped shut but sagging under the rainwater that had pooled on top. The coolers were scattered, their contents spilling onto the ground. Packets of biscuits, tins of soup, a half-empty bottle of water. The strangest part was that there was no sign of anyone. No cars parked nearby, no backpacks or personal belongings. And just the remnants of what should have been a weekend trip. It looked fresh, too. The ashes in the fire pit were damp, but recent, and the food hadn't been there long enough for the animals to get to it. We didn't stay long. It felt intrusive standing there among someone else's things, even if they weren't around to see us. We left the campsite as we'd found it and followed the trail further into the woods. But the mood had shifted, conversation faded, and we walked with a kind of quiet understanding, as if the trees themselves were listening. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, painting the trees in streaks of orange and gold. That night, the feeling of quiet that had been soothing the night before seemed sharper somehow. Every creak of the cabin made me look up from my book. The others didn't say much either, their faces set in the kind of frowns you wear when you don't realize you're frowning. We locked the doors before bed, something we hadn't bothered with the night before. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of movement outside. I thought it was just the wind in the trees, but then I realized it was more distinct. It had a pattern. Footsteps crunching on the gravel drive that led up to the cabin, followed by a pause, then more steps. It wasn't loud, but it was deliberate. I lay there, frozen in my bed, my eyes locked on the thin strip of moonlight that stretched across the ceiling. The sound circled the cabin once, then stopped. Minutes passed, but it didn't start again. Eventually, I convinced myself to check. I slid out of bed and crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The gravel drive was empty. The porch was empty. The woods beyond were dark and still. The next day, we didn't talk about it. I didn't know if the others had heard anything, and I wasn't keen to bring it up, but there was a tension between us, something unspoken that made the cabin feel smaller, more confined. We stuck to the porch for most of the day, drinking coffee and watching the trees. Every so often, one of us would glance towards the woods as if expecting something to appear. By late afternoon, we decided to leave early. The idea of spending another night there was suddenly unbearable. We packed up quickly, shoving things into bags without much care for organization. I was carrying the last of the bags to the car when I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the clearing, something moved. It wasn't clear enough to make out, just a shape that didn't belong. It was tall, thin, and its outline blurred against the branches, as if it wasn't quite solid. It didn't come closer, just stayed there, half hidden by the trees. My chest tightened, and I turned back towards the cabin, shouting for the others. When I looked back, it was gone. It was a Friday evening when he arrived. I remember because I'd been looking forward to getting the sale done all week. I'd listed the antique clock online. A gift from an aunt with a taste for odd things, something I'd never had much use for. It was old, intricate, and apparently valuable, judging by the interest it generated. Most of the messages I got were from time wasters or people offering ridiculous sums well below the asking price, but one stood out. He was polite, keen, and didn't haggle. He said he could come to collect it in person. I was cautious, of course. I'd read the stories, people being ripped off, buyers turning out to be scammers, but he seemed genuine. His messages were precise, no typos or emojis, just straightforward and to the point. He asked for my address, and after a moment's hesitation, I gave it to him. It was stupid, I know. Looking back, I can't think why I didn't suggest meeting somewhere public, but it didn't seem like a big deal then. Just a quick transaction at my doorstep. The knock came a little after 8. I'd already wrapped the clock in bubble wrap and packed it into a sturdy box. The packaging looked absurdly professional, like I was shipping it to a museum instead of handing it over to a stranger. I carried the box to the door, opened it, and there he was. He was tall, thin, and dressed neatly in dark jeans and a plain jumper. There was nothing remarkable about him. He looked exactly how I'd imagined, ordinary, nondescript. His face had the sort of neutral expression that could mean anything, polite interest, indifference, boredom. He didn't smile, but he didn't look unfriendly either, just there. He didn't rush to take the box. Instead, his eyes flicked past me, glancing over my shoulder into the house. I stepped back instinctively, shifting the box so it blocked his view. He nodded as if to say he understood and reached into his pocket for an envelope. I couldn't see the money, but the envelope looked full enough. I handed over the box. I thought it was over. It should have been over. But as I started to close the door, I noticed something. A shadow, or rather the absence of one. There was a man standing by the gate, leaning against it casually, arms crossed. He was watching us. I didn't know what to do. The man at the gate wasn't moving, wasn't coming closer, but his presence sent a jolt through me. I looked back at the buyer, expecting him to explain, but he wasn't looking at me anymore. His eyes were fixed on the man by the gate, and for a moment the two of them seemed to exchange some kind of silent signal. Then the buyer turned back, and his expression was different now, sharper, more focused. He asked if he could come in. Not with words, he didn't say anything, but with the way he stepped forward just enough to test the doorframe. I held my ground, blocking his path, but he didn't try to push past me. Instead, he turned his head slightly, like he was listening for something. I followed his gaze and realized I couldn't hear the man at the gate anymore. I looked out, and he was gone. That was when the panic set in. My stomach twisted as I thought about how many doors I'd left unlocked, how many windows were still open upstairs. I didn't know what they were planning, but I knew I couldn't let him inside. I told him I'd forgotten something, excused myself without meaning to, and shut the door firmly in his face. The latch clicked into place, but the sound did nothing to calm me. I turned the lock. The silence on the other side of the door was unbearable. I moved quickly, locking the back door and double-checking the windows, trying not to let my nerves get the better of me. My heart was hammering now, loud enough to drown out any faint noises I might have caught otherwise. By the time I returned to the front room, the box with the clock was sitting on the doorstep, untouched. He wasn't there anymore. Neither was the man by the gate. For a moment, I thought maybe they'd changed their minds, but that hope dissolved when I noticed the car parked across the street. It wasn't there earlier. I would have remembered it, an old saloon with rust eating at the edges. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see if anyone was inside, but I knew it wasn't empty. The house suddenly felt smaller, every creak and groan amplified as I moved from room to room, checking and rechecking the locks. My phone was in my pocket, but I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I told myself I'd wait it out, see if they left. Surely they couldn't stay there all night, not without drawing attention. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. I kept to the shadows, peeking through the curtains every so often. The car was still there. My skin prickled with the sensation of being observed, even though I couldn't see anyone. The streets outside were dark and empty, the kind of quiet that made you realize how far away everything else was. The lights flickered, just for a second, enough to make me freeze. My brain raced through all the things that could explain it. A power surge, an old circuit, but none of them felt real. I stayed there in the middle of the room, paralyzed by the thought of what might happen next. And then I heard it, a faint creak from upstairs. The sound didn't repeat, it didn't need to. I knew what I'd heard. The party had been my idea. It was nothing elaborate, just a casual get-together to shake off the monotony of another dreary weekend. I'd invited a dozen or so people, all familiar faces, all dependable for laughs and cheap wine. My house wasn't particularly large, but it didn't need to be. It was homey enough, and I'd cleaned it until it gleamed that morning, ready to host the rabble. People arrived in a staggered trickle, and before long the place was alive with the kind of noise that made you feel more alive just by being in it. Music thumped softly in the background, glasses clinked, and the low murmur of conversation swelled around me. I'd always liked the buzz of people chatting, a noise that filled up the empty corners of a house in a way silence never could. It was warm, comforting even. It must have been around 10 when I noticed them, a man I didn't recognize standing in the kitchen by the fridge, half turned away as though they belonged but didn't want to draw attention to it. They weren't doing anything particularly odd, just holding a beer, studying the label like it was written in a foreign language. I remember thinking I must have missed them being introduced. That kind of thing happened all the time at these parties. Someone would bring a +1 without mentioning it, and you'd spend half the night trying to work out who they belonged to. At some point I wandered over, offered a polite nod, and made myself busy checking the ice bucket on the counter. They didn't speak, didn't acknowledge me beyond the briefest flick of their eyes. It wasn't rude exactly, but it wasn't friendly either. I told myself not to make a big deal of it. Everyone had their own way of fitting into social situations. Maybe they were shy. Maybe they were just awkward. God knows I'd been both in my time. The evening moved on, and the house seemed to swell with people. Laughter and footsteps echoed against the walls, and the air grew thick with the mingled scents of perfume and beer and snacks left too long on warm plates. I drifted through the rooms, catching snippets of conversations, and eventually found myself in the living room, wedged between two of my friends on the sofa. It was one of those moments when you felt yourself relax without meaning to, the kind of easy comfort that only came from being around people you trusted. Then I saw them again. The same man, standing by the doorway like a shadow that hadn't been there a moment ago. Their face was plain, forgettable in a way that made you squint if you tried to recall it. They were watching the group, not staring, but noticing. Their eyes swept the room, catching on people like a net snagging fish. There was something about them that made me shift in my seat, made me feel less sure about the warmth of the room. I still didn't know who they were. They hadn't spoken to anyone as far as I'd seen, but somehow they weren't out of place. No one else seemed to notice them in the way I did. They'd floated into the gaps of the group, like smoke, filling up spaces without being seen. It was unnerving in a way I couldn't put into words. As the night crept on, I started seeing them everywhere. In the hallway, standing just beyond the kitchen doorway. On the stairs, their hand resting on the banister as though they'd been halfway up and stopped to listen. Always on the edge of things, always in the periphery. I kept meaning to ask someone, anyone, if they'd invited them, but every time I opened my mouth, the thought slithered away like it didn't want to be spoken aloud. By midnight, people had started to leave. Not all at once, but in pairs and threes, coats shrugged on and goodbyes tossed over shoulders. The house began to empty, and with it the noise dissolved into an eerie quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how big an empty house can feel. Only a handful of us were left by then, and I noticed with a creeping unease that the man hadn't left with the others. He was sitting in the armchair by the window now, his beer still untouched on the table next to him. I hadn't seen him sit there before. The sight of him in the chair, a chair that was mine, made my skin prickle. I couldn't explain it. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't even looking at anyone. Just sitting, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed somewhere in the middle distance like he was waiting for something only he knew about. It was the waiting that got to me. It made my chest tighten, my breath hitch, like the air was suddenly too thin. My friends were still there, scattered around the room in lazy poses, their conversation muted and half-hearted now. But he was the only thing I could focus on. And then I realized something that made my mouth go dry. I still didn't know his name. I hadn't seen him speak to anyone all night, hadn't heard a single word from his lips. The last few guests trickled out one by one, muttering thanks and good nights as they pulled the door shut behind them. By 1:30 it was just me, him, and the silence. I busied myself with tidying up, moving through the rooms with a kind of forced casualness that made my shoulders ache. When I returned to the living room, the chair was empty. I didn't hear the front door open, didn't hear the sound of footsteps on the stairs or in the hall. but I knew I wasn't alone. I picked up the key to Unit 74 from the auctioneer, my excitement barely held in check. The thrill of these auctions wasn't in the bidding, but in what came after. The rusted metal doors and padlocks were like a lottery ticket. Maybe worthless, maybe not. It was cheap entertainment, really, and every so often someone unearthed something worth more than they paid. The unit smelled like damp and old wood when I opened it. The contents weren't promising at first glance. Boxes stacked haphazardly, a bicycle with a bent frame, and what looked like a faded wedding dress hanging from a hook in the corner. I stepped inside, letting the light from the dim bulb overhead fight its way into the space. The deeper I went, the less I liked it. The room was cramped, its narrow confines closing around me as I moved past the mess. I found the tapes in a box that had been duct taped shut. The cardboard was soft and warped, but the tape had held its stickiness stubborn. Inside were videocassettes, 15 or 20 of them, each with a date scrawled in marker across its surface. No labels, no indication of what was recorded. It was curiosity more than anything that made me take one home and shove it into the old VCR I'd kept for no reason other than nostalgia. The image was grainy. The timestamp flickered in the corner. The 23rd of September 2003. The camera was fixed on a kitchen. Nothing particularly striking about it. Dated wallpaper, a kettle on the stove, a crooked shelf above the sink. The sound was faint, just the hum of the appliance or the distant murmur of traffic. I nearly stopped watching, thinking it wasn't worth my time. But then a woman walked into the frame, her back to the camera. She went about her business, boiling water, stirring something in a pot. There was nothing remarkable about her either. What struck me was the stillness of the shot, the sense that the camera wasn't meant to be there. The angle was too high, as if it had been set up deliberately in some hidden corner. My stomach turned when the woman paused mid-motion, a tilt of her head suggesting she'd heard something. She turned slowly toward the camera's unseen eye, and that was the end of the tape. It cut to static. I put in another tape, this one dated months later. It showed the same kitchen, empty now, but with signs of disturbance. A chair had been tipped onto its side, the cupboard doors were wide open, and something dark smeared the floor near the table. I watched for nearly 15 minutes, but the scene didn't change. No movement, no sound. I spent hours that night going through the rest of the tapes, one after another, different places, same feeling. A bedroom, a garden, a garage, each one silent, but weighted with a sense of intrusion. On one tape I noticed something new, a man. He wasn't in the foreground, but a shadow flitting past a window, a reflection in a mirror, always on the edges, always fleeting. It was somewhere around the 7th or 8th tape that the content shifted. No longer still shots of empty rooms, but recordings of people, their movements restrained, their faces marked by expressions I couldn't bear to describe. It was worse than any horror film because it was real. The sound of breathing came through faintly, barely audible beneath the static hiss. I don't know when I started glancing over my shoulder. The sense that I wasn't alone crept up on me, spreading outwards from somewhere deep and instinctive. The idea that someone had filmed these things was bad enough, but worse was the knowledge that they'd packed them away and left them behind, as if they'd never been worried about someone finding them. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw the faces from the tapes, their fear carved into my memory. By morning, I'd made up my mind to take them to the police. There wasn't another option. Whatever hesitation I'd felt was burned away by the images looping in my head. When I got back to the storage unit, something had changed. The door, which I'd locked, was open by an inch. The padlock lay on the ground. My first thought was thieves, but I couldn't shake the impression that whoever had been there hadn't come for just anything. They'd come for the box. Inside, the unit was just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The tapes were gone. My heart raced as I scanned the space, searching for some clue, some trace, but there was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no footprints in the dust. It was as if they'd vanished. I should have felt relieved, but all I felt was dread. Someone had taken them back, someone who didn't want them seen, who knew where to find them. The implications settled in my mind like a heavy stone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had made those tapes might not be finished. That night I lay awake, the memory of those flickering images crawling under my skin. Somewhere outside, a car engine rumbled faintly, and I found myself staring at the window, wondering if they knew I'd watched, wondering if they cared. We'd been driving for hours when we spotted him standing by the side of the road. The landscape stretched out endlessly, a barren highway cutting through empty fields. My wife had fallen asleep next to me, her head resting against the window. The sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting everything in muted tones of gold and grey. I might have passed him by, but something about the figure standing there, thumb outstretched, caught my attention. He was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing a faded jacket and jeans. His backpack sat at his feet, scuffed and dusty. I slowed the car without even thinking about it, and by the time my wife stirred awake, he was opening the back door, his pack slung over one shoulder. He slid in with a nod, muttering something I didn't catch. The door shut and we were off again. He settled in, staring out the window. My wife gave me a look but didn't say anything, just adjusted her seatbelt and turned her gaze back to the road ahead. I glanced in the mirror a few times. The hitchhiker sat rigid, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Something about him made me feel on edge. Maybe it was the way he didn't seem to relax, like he was bracing himself for something. I told myself he was just tired or nervous, that it wasn't every day someone picked you up in the middle of nowhere. The further we drove, the quieter he became. It wasn't like there'd been much chatter to begin with, but now the silence was different. It had a weight to it. I kept catching glimpses of him in the mirror, the way his hand tightened on the strap of his pack, the way his eyes darted to the rear-view mirror when he thought I wasn't looking. By the time we'd passed the next town, if you could even call it that, more like a collection of rundown houses and a petrol station, the hitchhiker seemed to grow restless. He shifted in his seat, his legs bouncing slightly, his fingers tapping against his knee. My wife leaned over and whispered something about finding a place to stop for the night, but I didn't answer. I was too focused on the man in the back seat. Something about him had changed. He wasn't looking out the window anymore. He was looking at us. Not directly, but his gaze kept flicking between me and my wife. It was subtle, almost like he was studying us. I tried to shake the feeling, telling myself I was being ridiculous. He was probably just trying to figure out where we were heading, maybe deciding when to ask to be let out. But that didn't explain the way his grip on his backpack had tightened, or the faint scratch on his cheek that looked redder now than when we'd picked him up. The next petrol station we stopped at, he insisted on staying in the car. My wife shot me a look, her expression tight, but she didn't say anything. I grabbed a couple of sandwiches and drinks, tossing them onto the seat as I got back in. He thanked me quietly, but he didn't eat. He just held the sandwich in his hand, staring down at it like he wasn't sure what to do with it. The road grew darker as night fell. The headlights cut through the gloom, illuminating the endless stretch of asphalt ahead. My wife dozed off again, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing in the mirror, watching the hitchhiker. He'd stopped fidgeting, his body unnervingly still now. His backpack was on his lap, and he had one hand resting on it, his fingers twitching occasionally. When we reached a stretch of highway where the nearest town was still miles away, he finally spoke. His voice was quiet, almost conversational, but the words didn't match the tone. He mentioned a car accident, said he'd been stranded for hours. There was something off about the way he said it, like he wasn't sure of the details himself. I asked a few polite questions, but his answers were vague, dodging specifics. My wife woke up about an hour later, her eyes darting between me and the hitchhiker. She didn't say anything, but I could tell she was tense. I wanted to reassure her, but I couldn't find the words. The road ahead was empty, no sign of other cars or even the faint glow of a town in the distance. Somewhere along the way, the hitchhiker asked us to pull over. He claimed he needed to stretch his legs, but his tone carried an edge that made my stomach knot. I pulled onto the shoulder, my hands gripping the wheel tightly. He climbed out, taking his backpack with him, and stood by the car for a moment, staring into the darkness. I don't know why, but I didn't trust him to stay out there alone. Something about the way he lingered by the side of the road, his posture tense, made me uneasy. My wife whispered that we should drive off, but before I could react, he was climbing back into the car, his expression blank. The next stretch of road felt like it would never end. The hitchhiker didn't say a word, and neither did we. Every sound seemed amplified. The tires on the asphalt, the roar of the engine, the rustle of fabric as he adjusted his seat. I kept one eye on the road and one on the mirror, my pulse thudding in my ears. Eventually, we came across a motel, its neon sign flickering faintly in the distance. My wife muttered something about stopping, and I didn't argue. The hitchhiker stayed quiet as I pulled into the lot, his hand still gripping his backpack tightly. I checked us into a room, and when I turned around, he was gone. The car door was wide open and his backpack was sitting on the seat, unzipped slightly. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Inside was something dark, something that smelled metallic and sharp. My stomach churned as I slammed the door shut, my hands trembling. I don't know where he went, but as the night stretched on, I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't far. The road outside the motel stretched out into the darkness, empty and quiet, but I couldn't help glancing at the shadows near the tree line, half expecting to see him standing there. It was just past 4 in the afternoon when the power went out. I remember because the kettle had just clicked off, and I'd reached for the milk when the flat went silent. The fridge gave one last groan before everything else followed. Lights, TV, even the faint buzzing from the hallway outside. It was as though the world had taken a breath and forgotten to exhale. I live on the 3rd floor of a block of flats in the city centre, not the sort of place you'd call cosy, but it's functional. Grey walls, cheap carpets, thin doors. The kind of building where you can hear your neighbours coughing through the plasterboard. On a normal day, it buzzes with life. Arguments, music, people clattering up and down the stairs, but when the power went, it was as if someone had drawn a curtain over everything. I stood at the kitchen counter for a while, listening. The street outside was silent. No engines, no honking horns, just an eerie, almost clean quiet. I opened the fridge and shut it quickly. The dark inside made me feel oddly guilty, as though I'd caught it unprepared. It wasn't until evening came that the building began to feel strange. Without the hallway lights, the corridors turned into black tunnels, and my flat seemed smaller somehow, as if the walls were inching in. I lit a candle and placed it on the coffee table, but the tiny flicker didn't reach far. It was strange to see my home reduced like that to a dim little island in a sea of shadows. I tried not to think too much about it. These things happen, I reasoned. The city's infrastructure wasn't built to withstand anything beyond ordinary wear and tear. It'd be back on by morning. That was what I told myself. The first odd thing was the sound. It came from above me, somewhere on the 4th floor. A thud, then another, then silence. I couldn't place what it might have been. Too solid for footsteps, too light for something heavy falling. The flats above mine were occupied. I was certain of that, but I didn't know much about the people. A young couple, maybe, or a single man. It wasn't like anyone kept close tabs on each other here. I tried not to dwell on it. People dropped things. Maybe someone was moving furniture. But it happened again and then again, 3 times in all, spread out over what felt like hours. I thought about going up to check, but the thought of stepping into that hallway, the pitch black of it, made me hesitate. Around 8, I heard something else. This time it was in the hallway, just beyond my door. A scuffle, almost like fabric being dragged against the floor. I froze. My flat felt suddenly very small, the walls too close, the ceiling too low. I waited, barely breathing, until the sound faded away. Then there was nothing. I kept telling myself it was just the lack of power. People were restless, disoriented. When everything's quiet, the smallest noises seem amplified. It wasn't anything to worry about. It couldn't be. At some point I must have dozed off. I woke up to darkness. The candle long since burned down to a puddle of wax. My phone was useless, the battery dead, so I stumbled to the window to check the street. Still nothing. Just the black outlines of buildings, the occasional flicker of torchlight in the distance. It was almost unnerving how total the outage was, as though the city itself had been abandoned. Then I heard the scream. It came from the building, no doubt about that, a high, sharp sound that froze me in place. It wasn't close, not on my floor at least, but it was enough to make my heart pound. I stood there for what felt like hours, straining to hear something else, anything else. But there was only silence. I didn't know what to do. My phone was dead, the landline was out. I didn't even know which flat it had come from. All I could do was wait, hoping someone else would take action, maybe someone with more sense, more courage. The next sound came from outside my door. This one wasn't a scream, but something far worse. It was a shuffle, then a scrape, then a dull knock. Not at my door, but close. It was moving, heading down the hallway. My hands shook as I grabbed a chair and wedged it under the doorknob. I told myself I was being ridiculous, but I did it anyway. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to make sense of the noises, the shuffling, the knocking. They were random, uneven, like someone groping their way in the dark. Then they stopped altogether. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the sofa, staring at the door, waiting for morning. The dark seemed endless. I lit another candle and placed it beside me, watching the small flame flicker, but it offered little comfort. When dawn finally came, the power was still out. The building was eerily quiet, more so than it should have been. I unblocked the door and stepped into the hallway, my legs trembling. The corridor was empty, though the smell hit me straight away. Metallic, sharp, faintly sweet. I backed into my flat and shut the door. I didn't leave again. Not until someone else knocked hours later, a tenant from downstairs, pale and wide-eyed, asking if I'd heard or seen anything during the night. People had been banging on doors, he said, trying to get neighbors to open up. 2 flats were empty now, completely. No sign of the people who lived there. I stayed in my flat the rest of the day, even as the sun set again and the building sank back into darkness. The power didn't come back. By nightfall, I heard the sounds again, this time closer than before. The room smelled faintly of bleach, the sort of scent that hinted more at a surface-level effort than any real commitment to cleanliness. It wasn't much of a room, cracked plaster walls painted over in a colour that had once been white, a threadbare carpet speckled with stains of unknown origin, and a bed with a quilt so thin it may as well not have existed. It was what I could afford, though. A cheap motel on the edge of a highway, the sort of place where you paid cash and got a key attached to a big plastic tag so you couldn't lose it. I'd come for work, a meeting at a small distribution company tucked in an industrial estate a few towns over. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. I'd arrived late, worn out from hours of driving, and all I wanted was to collapse for the night. The heater in the corner rattled and wheezed when I turned it on, but it kept the chill at bay, so I didn't complain. The television worked too, though it was small and ancient, with a faint buzzing noise you could only ignore if you turned the volume up high enough. I had unpacked the bare essentials, just my toiletries and a change of clothes, and was sitting on the bed scrolling through emails when I noticed the smoke detector. It was directly above the bed, a small white disc with a single blinking red light. Nothing unusual about that. It was the way the light blinked that caught my attention. Not the steady pulse I'd expect, but a kind of irregular flicker, like it wasn't sure whether to stop or start. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled the chair over from the desk, climbed up, and took a closer look. It wasn't a smoke detector, or rather it had been at one point, but the front panel had been tampered with, leaving a tiny lens where the sensor should have been. I froze for a moment, staring at it. A camera. The reality hit me in a way that made my skin crawl. Someone had been watching. Maybe they still were. I climbed down, my heart pounding in my chest, and turned to the rest of the room. The television sat innocuously in the corner. The mirror above the sink reflected the dull yellow of the ceiling light. The window had heavy curtains pulled shut. Nothing else seemed out of place, but how could I know? My hands were shaking as I turned back to the camera. I didn't touch it again. What if it was recording? What if someone was watching me right now? I pulled my phone out and looked up the number for the front desk. I'd only spoken to the man there briefly when I checked in, middle-aged, stocky, with a voice that had an edge of impatience. My thumb hovered over the call button. What would I even say? There's a camera in my room? Did they know? Were they the ones who put it there? I tried to shake the thought away, but it clung to me like a shadow. Instead, I packed my bag. Fast! Every movement felt like I was being watched, like a pair of eyes were boring into me. I'd find another place, even if it meant sleeping in my car. I grabbed my things and headed out the door, barely glancing at the dark corridor beyond. The carpeted hallway was dim, the bulbs overhead covered in thick plastic casings that diffused the light just enough to make everything feel incomplete. I reached the stairwell at the end and took the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to get out. The lobby was empty when I arrived. No one at the front desk, no sound except the faint hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The computer monitor behind the desk was on, its glow casting a faint green hue. I leaned over to see if I could spot anyone, and that's when I noticed the second screen. It was older, bulkier, and mounted on a bracket in the corner. It was split into a grid of tiny black and white feeds, security cameras. And in one of those feeds, I saw my room. The camera was still live. I don't remember moving, but suddenly I was at the front desk, slamming my hands against the bell over and over. The sound echoed through the empty lobby. I waited, chest heaving, but no one came. I turned back to the screen. There was another room on the feed, another bed, another live shot of someone sitting on the edge of their mattress, completely unaware. I grabbed the phone on the desk and started dialing the police. But before I could finish, a door behind the counter creaked open. A man stepped out, not the same one I'd met earlier, but someone younger, with a gaunt face and a blank expression. He looked at me, then at the phone in my hand. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he reached under the counter. I don't remember running, but I must have. My shoes barely made contact with the ground as I burst out into the night air. The car park was nearly empty. My car, one of only a handful, parked beneath the flickering streetlights. I fumbled with the keys, dropping them once, twice, before finally managing to unlock the door. I threw myself inside, locked the doors and started the engine. In the rear-view mirror, I caught movement. The man from the desk standing in the motel doorway, watching me. Behind him, the older man I'd spoken to earlier, and behind them, another figure I hadn't seen before. They didn't move, just stood there side by side, watching as I drove away. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, until the motel was just a bad memory fading into the dark. But now, even weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that I didn't get away. At home in my flat, I find myself checking the smoke detectors, the light fittings, the cracks in the walls, because sometimes, late at night, I see a red light blinking where it shouldn't be. The woods stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of trees that seemed to swallow the sky. It was meant to be a weekend getaway, a break from lectures and essays, something to remind us that life could still be simple. There were 5 of us, all piled into 2 cars, laughing about the mundane chaos of the drive out here. By the time we parked and started hiking, the laughter was fading, replaced by the rustle of wind through branches and the crunch of leaves underfoot. The campsite wasn't much, a clearing by a small stream. We spent the first afternoon pitching tents, gathering wood, and getting a fire going. There was something about the place, though. It wasn't silent exactly, but it had a kind of stillness. The air felt thinner, and even when the breeze came through, it didn't seem to stir anything. By nightfall, we were sitting around the fire, cracking open beers and sharing stories, as if the flickering flames could push away the weight of the trees. It was only when I woke up the next morning that I noticed something was off. The fire was nothing but cold ash, and Sam wasn't in his tent. I figured he'd gone to relieve himself or scout for more firewood, but when he didn't show up for breakfast, we started calling his name. There was no reply. His boots were gone, along with his jacket, so it seemed like he'd wandered off, but no one remembered hearing him leave. The 4 of us split up to search, keeping within shouting distance. The undergrowth was dense, and the further we went, the less familiar everything became. The trees were taller here, older. The ground was softer, spongier underfoot, and every so often there was the sound of something moving in the distance, branches snapping, leaves crunching, but it never seemed to come from anywhere specific. By midday, there was no sign of Sam. We regrouped, more annoyed than worried, thinking he'd probably found some rock to sit on and was waiting for us to find him. That night was different. We kept the fire going, but it didn't feel like it was enough. The woods pressed in on us, the dark somehow darker than it had been the night before. None of us mentioned it, but I could see it in the others' faces, the way their eyes darted to the edges of the clearing. We didn't talk much. It was as if we were afraid of hearing something that shouldn't be there. By morning, we were down to 3. Claire's tent was empty, her sleeping bag unzipped, the flap left hanging open. This time there was no argument about whether we should look for her. We just grabbed what we could, torches, water bottles, a map, and headed out. The air seemed colder, the light weaker. The forest felt like it was pulling us in, like every step took us further away from where we started. We shouted her name until our throats were raw, but the only answer was the wind through the branches. Then, as we crossed a ridge, the scream came. It wasn't Claire's voice, though. It was Josh's. I spun around, but he wasn't there anymore. There was no sign of him, no broken branches or trampled ferns. It was like he'd been plucked out of the world. It was just me and Beth now, and we didn't waste any time. We bolted back towards camp, stumbling over roots and rocks. The clearing looked smaller than before, the fire pit cold and empty. We didn't stay long, just grabbed what we could carry and ran. It felt like the forest was closing in behind us, the trees leaning closer, the path narrowing. When we reached the cars, we didn't stop to think. Beth's hands were shaking too much to use her keys, so I drove, speeding down the dirt track, tires skidding on the loose gravel. We didn't stop until we hit the main road, where we called the police from a roadside diner. They organized a search party, dozens of volunteers combing the woods with dogs and torches. For 3 days they searched, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no dropped belongings, not even a torn scrap of fabric. It was like the others had never been there. The official report said they were presumed lost, that maybe they'd gotten disoriented and wandered deeper into the forest. But I know they didn't. I could still hear Josh's scream in my head, sharp and sudden, like something had grabbed him and yanked him into the dark. The others didn't just get lost. Something took them. Something in those woods. I never went back. Never,